Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back to Sweet Script Stories, hosted by Salto. My name is Eric, and I am joined by my illustrious co-host, Tim Dietrich. And today we are here to talk about data migration in NetSuite with Paul Giese of Optimal Data Consulting. Welcome, Paul.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us just a really quick who you are, what you do, and what Optimal Data does? And then we'll get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Paul. I'm the founder of Optimal Data Consulting, and we help companies that are implementing NetSuite move their legacy data into NetSuite using some proprietary Python code that I've written, and have worked on about 60 to 65 implementations since 2020, and excited to talk about some of the tips and tricks and experience that I've had helping clients with their NetSuite implementation today.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Before we get started, this episode is hosted and sponsored by Salto. And Salto has built a powerful DevOps platform for SuiteScript developers to manage and track and deploy their changes into NetSuite. So if you would like to learn more about that, check out salto.io. And with that, I'm going to kick it to Tim to start the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you. Paul, thanks for doing this. I've really been looking forward to this interview because I've kind of been following you on LinkedIn for a while, and I think you post some very interesting content that I think is somewhat unique. I think your background in accounting, which we'll talk about in a minute, you bring a perspective and a skill set to the NetSuite space that I'm not seeing or hearing about from other people. And I don't get to talk to accountants in the NetSuite space very often either. It's usually other developers or managers. So, again, with your accounting background, I think this is going to be very interesting. So I want to kind of kick it off by just kind of having you tell us a little bit more about the kind of work that you're doing and your company. Again, it's Optimal Data Consulting.
Yeah, so maybe I could start with kind of how I fell into data migration and doing this. So I implemented NetSuite back, I guess, in 2016 at a company called Surface Oncology. We were a biotech company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We were on the IPO track, and so that was why we decided to move from QuickBooks to NetSuite. And so I learned NetSuite. And kind of at my time at Surface, I kind of had a business idea, learned how to code on nights and weekends, and that idea never kind of went anywhere. But I kind of found myself as like a internal project manager for biotechs implementing NetSuite and other software. And so one of my first clients, I was talking to them, kind of preparing them for what the data migration. And they were like, hey, well, I want to bring in my detailed transactions from QuickBooks. And I kind of I started with like, hey, that's a bad idea. It'll never reconcile, kind of the standard responses that, most partners give when clients bring that up. And I was like, well, I know how to code. Like, I'll try. Why not? Like, let's see if we can make this work. And so I ended up writing Python code to basically create the CSV files, and definitely pretty rocky. I remember like Saturday night before their go live, like at 3 a.m., like manually adjusting transactions because I was like, it didn't work quite right. But by Monday morning, everything tied out. And so the partner, Sikich, they were very excited. They thought they were really happy with the work I did. The client was really happy. And so Sikich started bringing me into other projects. And so then I quickly realized whoa, there's a business here. People really are interested in the data migration, having that like detailed transactions brought in. And so that's really how I kind of became, I guess the data migration specialist in the NetSuite space.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about what your path to NetSuite was. And then just talking a little bit about your background, like you have a master of accountancy, I think from Baylor, right? You worked at PwC for a while and from what I could tell from your LinkedIn, it looks like you kind of rose up through the ranks a bit there before kind of going off, and you did a bunch of different things before starting
Yeah.
optimal data. So
Yep.
that's
Yeah. So
interesting.
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, how important do you think that CPA background has been to what you're doing now? I mean, is that something that, you know, on a daily basis you're like, wow, I'm so glad that you have that skill, or
Yeah.
is it not as important as it used to be for you?
I think maybe not so much the CPA license itself, but definitely the accounting background. I think there's really two, primary reasons for why accounting is essential if you're going to do data migration. I mean, first, I think you have to understand like the debit and credit implications for loading transactions. Like if you don't understand like that, hey, a vendor bill isn't a natural credit, it's going to always credit an AP account. Like you kind of have to understand how different transactions will impact the trial balance, which is really at the end of the day, you're migrating data. That's the finish line. It's like if my legacy trial balance matches to my NetSuite trial balance, then I know everything came over correctly, or I can be 99% certain that the balances came over correctly. So I think that's really important. And obviously, without an accounting background, it can be challenging to understand the debits and credits. I think the other piece of my experience at PwC when I was an auditor, and then in the couple, companies I worked at after where I was audited, right? That's another component of the data migration and the service that I provide is getting my clients and their controllers comfortable with how do I get my financial statement auditors through their implementation process. So part of my process is writing a memo where I document that a bill transaction in QuickBooks is going to come over as a vendor bill in NetSuite, and credit card transactions will come over as journal entries. I document all that process and then provide all of their like trial balance tie-outs, the AP and AR subledger tie-outs, and so they get this audit documentation package that they can then just send to their auditors to say, hey, like we're comfortable that the closing balance sheet in QuickBooks ties to the beginning balance sheet in NetSuite. And so that, that process, I think that's usually a pretty big, I think, stressor for especially the controller for the company. If you're, making sure like, hey, like how am I getting my auditors comfortable that everything came over correctly and that there's nothing materially wrong. And so I think that's really helped me relate to my clients so that they kind of understand like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. He can interface with auditors. I mean, one of my clients, I was on a call with their auditors talking through kind of how the data migration worked. And so, I try to provide that type of experience for my clients.
Interesting. Eric, you have anything? Or you want me to keep asking away? I have a million questions I could ask here, so.
Yeah, I think, mostly for me, I'm really curious about, obviously Tim and I are developers. We have a largely developer audience. So I'm very curious to get into like sort of the details and the tools and how you go about doing this, doing the imports, about these Python tools you have, any other tools you use. I'm very curious about that stuff. We don't quite need to jump there yet if we don't want to. But that's what I'm really interested to see how you go about that. Do you have a team? Before I jump to that, do you have a team? Is it just you?
It's currently my business right now is me. I've got an assistant who onboarded with me a couple weeks ago. My brother helped me learn how to code, so he certainly coached me in kind of developing kind of the code structure and getting my Python tools like up and running. And then I've got a sales and marketing consultant. But as far as like the ends deliverable work, that's me. I do at this point, I'm doing almost all the work.
Gotcha. In that case, I love how specific the business is, right? Like NetSuite's already small. Doing NetSuite implementations is even smaller. And you are doing a small portion of a NetSuite implementation. Like you're doing a very focused facet of a small part of a small niche. And I love it because I immediately know what you do in one sentence, right? Your LinkedIn headline is very obvious. You know if you need that. You know, your clients know if they need that right away. There's no mystery. And I love that.
Yeah,
well, I think it's like what you guys have said on other podcasts. It's like if NetSuite, you know, it is small, but it's a vast tool, and there's so many things to know. You know, it's funny, like Tim saying, you know, hey, like I only interact with NetSuite developers, and I'm like, I pretty much only interact with NetSuite accountants, like, you know. So it's like, you know, I think like there's just so much to know, and I think that's, you know, part of, you know, running a, you know, a successful NetSuite business is, I think, knowing like, hey, this is where my experience kind of is less, and so I know somebody who knows a lot about that area, and I think that's what it makes, you know, I think any ecosystem, you know, really, you know, healthy, is that it's like knowing like, hey, this is my strength. I don't know everything, you know. It's you know, I had a client that, you know, they're asking about their item structure, and that's something, you know, given my experience in biotech, I don't really deal with manufacturing item configurations, and so we're reaching out to another partner who I know does have experience with that, and then bringing them into the project too to help.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, Eric, we've talked about this before, but the more that you sort of, I think the phrase that we've used is sort of niche down, you know, like find a specialization. It gets easier for people like us to say, when somebody asks me about data migration, you're my go-to person for that now. So yeah, and we've talked about that before, you know, for people that are trying to break into the NetSuite space, that if you can find an area of specialization, I think you're going to find success. So sounds like you've done that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's really kind of how it's really specializing in a specific niche. And then, you know, my LinkedIn strategy is all about that. It's like talking about this niche, you know, trying to write value add content for my audience so that if they're following me, they're learning about what are tips and tricks for data migration. And I would encourage anybody who wants to start their own business within the NetSuite ecosystem is to find some area that you know a lot about, or you really are passionate about or excited about, and to, you know, start writing about it and finding, you know, a client or two that you can maybe do on the side. I mean, because, you know, I was doing this on the side, you know, for a good, you know, year and a half during COVID, before it kind of snowballed into a large enough business to be on my own.
I did want to ask you about something. You've mentioned migrating from QuickBooks to NetSuite. I'm wondering if, like, is that the majority of the migrations that you're doing and the requests that you're seeing? And if there's other systems that you are, you know, seeing that people are making the migration from?
Yeah, I'd say probably 80% of my business is either QuickBooks Online or QuickBooks Desktop.
Okay.
So that's definitely the majority. That I'd say the next type of implementation that I've helped with the most is like a NetSuite to NetSuite migration, where, you know, a client, I think the two kind of common scenarios that I've seen are if a client implemented NetSuite, you know, years ago, and maybe they didn't install OneWorld in their instance, and they have their US instances there, and then they grow an international business and they're running their own NetSuite instance, and then they decide, well, we want to merge these two instances together. That's a fairly common, I think I've had that come up, you know, once or twice. And then another instance of someone moving between NetSuite instances was a company they were a solar panel company, and they'd implemented like NetSuite probably with like professional services a while ago, and then they were implementing Blue Banyan has like a micro vertical, like I think it's called Solar Success, and so they wanted to utilize their IP that they had developed, and so they were moving from their old NetSuite instance to this Bluebonian product. And so those are, but other than that, so then NetSuite, and then I've seen a couple Great Plain projects that I've got going on right now, but then everything else is kind of more one-offs. Like I've done like a Xero implementation. That's, for those of you who don't know, Xero is like the international version of QuickBooks. So they're very popular in the UK, and I think they're a New Zealand company. So they're kind of the international equivalent to what QuickBooks is in the US. And then a couple other like Epicor, a couple Sage implementations. But yeah, the vast majority of people are moving off of QuickBooks.
Just a quick follow-up on that too. Have you been involved in people going the other way, like going from NetSuite to something else? And is that something that you help with?
I've surprisingly never been asked to move somebody off of NetSuite to something else. I mean, I think because my business, because it is just me, or me and a small team of contractors, I was approached by a company that I think they were like an auto parts distributor, right? They said they had a 30,000 item catalog, probably tens of thousands of transactions a day, and they were like, "Oh, can you help us?" And it's like, that's just the scale of a project that size is just way too big for what I can help with. And so I think because of that, like at this point, I've got enough business doing, NetSuite implementations that I think if somebody were like, hey, like we're moving from NetSuite to SAP, would probably, could help them maybe write some save searches, but, for the most part would probably too small at this point to take on that type of work. I mean, why would anybody leave NetSuite?
Right. Yeah. I was hoping you'd say just no.
I guess that's the right answer, right?
Yeah. Got it.
But knowing, especially when you're flying solo, knowing and accepting your sort of, I don't want to say limitations, but like setting some boundaries and holding them of what you will say no to. I very much appreciate that. I see way too much. You see consultants just willing to say yes to anything, even if it's brand new to them or way out of their wheelhouse. And so it's refreshing to hear people say no.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the consultant's dilemma. It's like you go from like no work, like where's my next project coming from, to then all of a sudden everybody wants something yesterday, and you're like, oh man, how am I going to get all this work done? I wish there was like a magic button of like, oh, let's just have that perfect 35 hours of billable work a week.
While we're talking about QuickBooks, especially, we do have a question here that's relevant. So QuickBooks and NetSuite, pretty common. This is from Anonymous. But what are some strategies you found or lessons you've learned from that, going QuickBooks to NetSuite, or just generally?
Yep.
But
yeah, so how to like prepare for a migration from QuickBooks to NetSuite.
What to look for, strategies, tactics that you've developed.
Yeah, so I would say, I think the first thing that you definitely want to do, especially if you're not bringing in your historical transactions, is make sure to get your bank reconciliations and your credit card reconciliations like caught up within a month or two. I think I've had a couple clients where they were a little bit further behind, and I think that caused a lot of headache and challenges to get those bank and credit card reconciliations caught up. So I would say that's definitely one step for the accounting team to make sure like that you're caught up on before you go live. I think also cleaning up your AP and your AR subledger, making sure like if you've got customer payments that should be applied to invoices, getting all that stuff applied and cleaned up as much as possible will make the migration a little bit cleaner. I think the other thing that's more big picture for the company is the segment structure. So QuickBooks has a more limited segment structure. And by segment structure, I'm talking about like chart of accounts, departments, classes, locations, subsidiaries. Oftentimes clients will, part of the reason they're moving to NetSuite is because they want to have a more robust segment structure. And so you can really begin thinking about what you want your new segment structure to look like well before you implement NetSuite. And I think the more prepared you are as a company for what you want that segment structure to look like will make the transition easier, not only for like learning a new segment structure, but also transitioning your data from, say like, a common scenario I've seen is like a client will have like a salaries G&A account and a salaries R&D account. And instead of having two salaries accounts, we should really have one salaries account and then leverage a department structure to say, I've got a G&A department and an R&D department. And so you can clean up a lot of that in a data migration. Part of my process is cleaning that up. So you could say like, hey, this journal entry, we're going to map all of those accounts now to a single salaries account, and then use the bifurcate your data with a department and a class structure. And so I think that the more work you can do on creating that segment structure and then mapping the segment structure will really help you in that transition and preparing, especially for the data migration. And then I guess the last sort of thing, like task that often is at the bottom of everybody's list is like cleaning up your vendors and cleaning up your customers, like going through that list. I don't think there isn't much harm in bringing over extra vendors and customers. I mean, within reason, obviously. But I think as much of that cleanup work that you can do in your legacy system of consolidating, like if you've got Fisher Scientific and Fisher Scientific Inc. and Fisher Scientific LLC, like let's create all three of those as one vendor and then be done with it instead of having three different ones. That's always good too. But that's ambitious for most accounting teams that have a lot of other things going on to clean the vendor and customer list.
I saw, and I mentioned this before we went live, I saw that you'd recently posted something from Anderson Frank that I thought it was interesting. And basically it was saying that the biggest reason for NetSuite implementations being delayed is data migration. I think that's like 40% of the time that's the cause of NetSuite being delayed as far as going live goes. Has that been your experience too? I mean, is that common when you're talking to people that are, especially those coming to you asking for help at the last minute?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a fairly common, I think, experience. I mean, I think what ends up happening is clients either expect that the implementation partner is going to do all the data migration, or that it's going to be straightforward and simple to move that data over, which ends up not being that simple or straightforward. And so yeah, I think when oftentimes customers will come to me or prospects will come to me kind of reaching out saying, hey, we're a couple of weeks out from our go live date, we're stuck in the data migration, can you help me? And that's a great, I really am happy that I can help those clients help get the data in fairly quickly. Thankfully, because I've automated a lot of the tasks, and especially if the master records have already been loaded, it's a matter of just doing that mapping exercise and then loading the data. And so yeah, I think if you've never been through an ERP implementation before and you're tasked with preparing and loading those journal entries, I mean, we're talking about just the summary trial balances, let alone like the detailed transactions. Mm-hmm. That can be really challenging if you are unfamiliar with how your legacy system works. I mean, I think what I end up seeing is that, and kind of where I fit into the project, right, is that the implementation partner will know NetSuite, but they don't necessarily know your legacy system. The client, they know their legacy system, but they don't know NetSuite, right? And so there's kind of a disconnect. And so I think the secret sauce is being like, well, I know QuickBooks and I know NetSuite and I know how your accounting data works. And so that's kind of the value add that I bring, that I obviously can't speak for all, NetSuite consultants. Certainly there are some that know QuickBooks well, but I do know for a fact that, several implementation partners have, oftentimes when if you're paying an implementation partner to do your data migration, it's a junior staff person who's on the bench who doesn't have another project to work on. And so they might know data migration, but they might not. And so it just depends on the experience.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you something specific, and this also goes back to something that I saw you posted on LinkedIn. I don't know whether that was recently or not, but I'm going to quote you on this because I wrote it down. I thought it was great. Is you don't settle for moving just 20% of your belongings when you buy a new house. You wouldn't settle for that, rather. So why settle for less with your NetSuite instance? And so the question that I think leads out of that is, and I've run into this in dealing with some clients that have just either gone through an implementation or they're going through it, and that is, when it comes to bringing over historical transactions, bringing over the details, shouldn't they? I mean, I would imagine that it's going to be like, you're going to answer that and say, well, it depends, right? But, and I also, my experience has been that most of the time people try to dissuade the client from doing that because they just want to get the implementation done, get live. But there are implications further down the road, I think. And so I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I'm going to say it depends. I mean, I think the standard NetSuite professional service SOW is 12 months of summary TBs. I believe that's kind of their standard, and that's pretty minimal. I mean, I think only a very simple business that is running QuickBooks, I think that's sufficient. Now, obviously, right, there's a business case. You have to make the business case for bringing over the data, right? Like, I'd say a couple of the common reasons to bring more of your transactional data over is if you're selling products, right, and you have sales reps that are in NetSuite, being able to look and see like that I sold what customer I sold what item to for the past 2 years or whatever your sales cycle is, I think that's really valuable data to have, because sales is a very essential part of running a business. So I think that's component one. For the accounting teams, if you're subject to the financial statement audit, if you're going to have a hard time, you're going to have to pull data from 2 systems during that first audit post go live from NetSuite, because if you go live on September 1st, the data from 1/1 through 8/31 is going to be in QuickBooks, and then the data from 9/1 to 12/31 will be in NetSuite. And so that requires twice the work to kind of compile that data. Again, you can overcome that. I mean, when I implemented NetSuite, that's what we did, and we survived. But it can be, it's extra work. And then I think the other component is like, if you're budget versus actuals, or if you have a strong FP&A group, it can be nice to be able to drill into 2 or 3 years of data and say, okay, like we spent $50,000 with Charles River in Q2 of 2022 for this program, and we spent $250,000 in Q2 2023. If you drill in NetSuite and you brought over the transactional data, right, you see the actual bills and you have all the metadata that's assigned to those transactions, as opposed to like just a summary journal entry that would still have the total amount, but you're not going to actually see all the details.
Yeah.
And then I think the final component is some of the great modules that NetSuite's built out, like the demand planning or the Cash 360 module. Like, if you implement NetSuite and you don't bring any of that data over, you can't really leverage those tools until you bring in sufficient history to feed into those models. Versus if you bring in some of your transactional history, then you've already got the AP and the AR activity for your customers and your vendors, and so you can start to leverage some of that functionality sooner than you otherwise would.
Yeah, I think.
But
I've seen that too. Like, there's something more disappointing, I think, than when you go to show a client a report. Maybe it's just after go live and they're trying to compare one period to a period in the past, and then they realize, oh, that's right, we've been in business for 5 years, but we've been on NetSuite for 6 months, and they're desperate to be able to compare things that whether it was partially loaded or not loaded at all. And then the other part of it is, when you've got sales reps or, anybody really in an organization where they're looking in a newly implemented NetSuite account and they need something from the previous system that didn't come over, then they've got to, log into the other system. Maybe it's still there, maybe it's archived or, or they're running in parallel. And it just becomes this, oh, yeah, we probably should have brought everything over. So curious too with that. Is that a decision that you think, do you help companies make that decision and show them yeah, we could do that, and here's the price difference if we just
absolutely. I mean, I think in my opinion, I think the price point, obviously it depends on the business, but I think if you bring in more than 2 years of transactional history, I think you're starting to overpay for what the value I think you're going to get. I think in my opinion, it's like if you were going live on September 1st, 2023, I think 22 and 23 transactions is probably going to be sufficient. And then I think anything other than past that, you would bring in the summary trial balances. And then I think for the summary trial balances are pretty straightforward to prepare. And in my opinion, that then you can just kind of see, okay, here's our 5-year trend. And you can kind of look at it, but chances are, I mean, obviously every business is different, the sales cycle is different, but most likely you're not looking at customer sales history, going 5 years back. Now, obviously maybe you are, but I mean, you'd be surprised. I mean, I've definitely had clients that have gone very far back, and they're really willing to pay to bring in all that transactions. And obviously, hey, it's that's an option for you, but obviously it's more expensive. And I think at a certain point, you got to weigh, maintaining a QuickBooks read-only license isn't that expensive. But if your vendor's sunsetting your legacy system and you're never going to be able to access that again, okay, well, now you're in a different story. So it just depends.
Got it. Eric, I feel like I've been asking all the questions and dominating, but do you have anything?
Yeah, we're at about the halfway point here. I've been answering a couple questions directly in the chat here, but yeah, I think I'd love to start hearing about the tooling that you use and how you mentioned this Python sort of scripts or a system a few times. So I'd love to start hearing about that. You don't have to give away any secrets you don't prefer to, but I'm really curious about what it does and how it helps and sort of the thought process behind it, the design philosophy behind it, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So right now, so I've built the tool in Python. Currently, I don't have any sort of API functionality that's pulling data from QuickBooks or pushing data into NetSuite. So everything is pull data out of QuickBooks or the legacy system into Excel, run it through a Python tool. The Python tool creates the CSV upload files, and then I load those into NetSuite. And so you're kind of working with the limitations of NetSuite's CSV functionality. So an example of that is deposit transactions. You can't upload those into NetSuite via CSV. That's a pretty straightforward workaround because you just load those as journal entries, and that works fine. But I'm hoping as my business grows to kind of expand into some of the API functionality, both pulling data out of legacy systems and pushing data into NetSuite. But right now, I just haven't had to get to that point. I think from a technical perspective, what my tool does is it does all those mappings that I was talking about, right? So if you in your legacy system, you've got GL accounts and classes in QuickBooks, and now you're going to use accounts, departments, and classes. In NetSuite, we can map the department segment based on your GL account structure in QuickBooks, and then it'll add the NetSuite department to those CSV upload files. And so I've gotten pretty creative with clients that are like, well, I didn't have that segment structure in my old system, or it's I inherited this horrible segment structure in QuickBooks, and I want to put in my new segment structure. So like I've had clients completely change the segment structure, and I can accommodate that. And it's obviously it's a little bit more work, and there's more risk that, hey, maybe we mismapped something, but for the most part, I've built in checks within my tool so that, for example, you're not mapping a QuickBook expense account to a NetSuite liability account, right? Because if you did that, then your financial statements aren't going to work correctly. So I'm checking to make sure that all of your expenses are going to P&L accounts and all your balance sheet accounts are going to other balance sheet accounts. Those type of checks. The other type of check that I'm doing is making sure, like, there are different rules in NetSuite around transaction types that aren't in QuickBooks. So one example would be in QuickBooks, you can create a check transaction where you're dispersing cash without assigning a name to the check, right? So it's a blank, it's like a check to nobody, basically. It's just a check transaction. Now in NetSuite won't let you do that, right? NetSuite says, well, you have to assign like a payee to your check. And so like if you just were to say, hey, well, I'm going to bring in all these check transactions, like if you don't check for a name being assigned on the check transaction, you're going to have a bunch of errors when you upload that data. And so I catch that, and I either convert those to journal entries, or I tell the client like, hey, what do you want to do with these? We need to assign a payee to these transactions. And so there's a variety of these type of, like, I guess, exceptions or discrepancies between QuickBooks and NetSuite that I've kind of learned over the years that I've tried to incorporate into my Python code, so that when I load the data, there's not as many variances, or there are fewer manual variances that I have to kind of adjust. And so that helps me be much more efficient at turning around projects where, yeah, somebody reaches out, 2 weeks from their go live date. They're like, hey, I want to load 50,000 transactions from QuickBooks into NetSuite. Can we still hit our go live date? And say, yeah, we can. Obviously we got to move fast, but that's like that's kind of I think what the Python code that I've developed over the years has kind of allowed me to build in those type of checks to ensure that the data comes over correctly. I don't know if that answered your question, Eric, about kind of getting into the technical piece of how the tool works.
Yeah, I think definitely at a high level, I'd love to be having you pull up code and talking through architecture and design philosophy. We're not going to do that, but I'm not going to ambush you with that. So how much of it is like you get, a client, and over the years you've built in all these branches and exceptions and handling for those? How much of it for each client are you going in and adjusting the tool before you run it versus, or is it pretty stable where most of your clients, you just export, run it through the tool, and you're almost ready to go?
I wish it was more like the latter. It depends on the client. Obviously, I think QuickBooks, because I've done so many of those ones, at this point, those projects tend to be pretty, like, straightforward. There's always new things that I haven't seen before. Two examples that I can think of recently I had a client in QuickBooks that had a bunch of parent-child relationships on their customer side. And so, like, applying those payments into NetSuite kind of created a little bit of hiccups in kind of doing their AR subledger tie-out. And then another one was in QuickBooks, at least in QuickBooks Desktop, when oftentimes you can, clients will give you a discount if you, like, pay early, for example. In QuickBooks, when you assign that discount, you can actually assign any GL account within the ledger to code that discount to. In NetSuite, at least natively, you can only assign a single discount account. And so that was something new that I hadn't seen before in a project that I did a couple months ago. And so we had to like manually, created journal entries basically to reclass those balances to the correct GL accounts. But I'd say for the most part, like for QuickBooks, those projects at this point are pretty straightforward. Some of the other systems are a little bit more like we're kind of learning, like it's like, hey, like you got to kind of learn a little bit more about how like GP's data structure works and how do you actually, to be honest, the biggest challenge is generally extracting data out of the system is almost always the hardest part. Like if I can get the data in Excel, like I understand the structure that I need to get the data into NetSuite. It's just always a matter of how do we get the data out of the legacy system. I'd say that's usually that's what keeps me up at night whenever I have a system I'm less familiar with. It's like, all right, how do we get this data out in a reasonable way?
Are there certain NetSuite modules or features that when you learn that a client that's about to do an implementation and they're asking you for help, they bring something up and you're like, oh, no. But does that happen, or for the most part, is it,
Yeah, well, I'd say like one, I guess, limitation in my tool that I haven't really gotten into here is inventory and manufacturing. So if a client is a heavy manufacturer where they're recognizing cost of goods sold on items, that's an accounting area that I personally am not super familiar with and is very complicated. And I think it's quite different between QuickBooks and NetSuite. And so actually, if a client is a manufacturer and they're like, hey, we want to bring in all our GL history, I just won't do that because there's too many risks associated with kind of bringing in that level of detail. And there's also limitations to the types of transactions that you can import, right? So you can't really import item receipts, can't really bring in a lot of the item activity. There are limitations to how you can bring that in. And you also can't override the cost of goods sold on an item record. It's determined based on how the item's configured, at least as far as I know. I mean, maybe someone in the audience knows a way to get around that I don't. So please reach out if you do, but I don't know how to do that. And so I generally, in those instances, I kind of talk to the client like, well, what are you really trying to get at? And usually we want our sales history. And so it's like, well, we can get around that by, you can load your sales history as like closed cash sale transactions and then reverse the GL impact of the cash sale transaction with a journal entry and then load the trial balances after that. And I've done that several times with clients that have, that are really more physical inventory. They're working with physical inventory.
I guess another question for you. How challenging is it for you when you have an account where there's, multi-currency involved and all that good stuff? Is that a challenge for you, or have you had to tackle that and now it's just built right into your tool?
Multi-currency can be challenging. It depends on how they've been tracking it. But QuickBooks does have some multi-currency functionality. And so if you're using QuickBooks' multi-currency functionality, then it'll come over into NetSuite the correct way. In the more challenge, the area where there's more challenge is actually with multi-subsidiary. That can be very challenging depending on how the client has been tracking their data historically. QuickBooks does not really have a good method for tracking subsidiary transactions. And so what I always tell clients, and if you're listening and you're using QuickBooks, like if you have separate subsidiaries, they should all have their own QuickBook instance. Like if you don't do that, you're going to have a nightmare trying to load that data into NetSuite. And I'm working with a client right now that didn't set up separate QuickBook files for each subsidiary. and it's been extremely challenging. I think they've had to delay their project a couple times. And so that I think is definitely, that's far more complex. And that's definitely something when a client's like, oh yeah, we've got multiple subsidiaries. That's definitely something where I'm like, whoa, we got to dive into that and figure out how have you been tracking that? And what are your expectations for bringing in those historical consolidated financials into NetSuite?
Yeah, it really sounds, when you were talking earlier about prepping to do an implementation and prepping the data, it sounded very much like some of the things that you would normally do to prepare for or actually do an audit, right? And so it sounds like if you've been through that, you kind of know what you're either in for or maybe should be in for in terms of getting the data ready. Is that a fair statement, do you think?
I'd say that's fairly certain, or fair statement, that if your financials are audited correctly and you've got the correct segregation of duties set up, I think you should be good to go. Again, I think it does depend on the data structure. I mean, I think thinking about this client where we've had the challenges with the subsidiary structure, I mean, they've been audited, and so like I think he can produce the consolidated financials are correct, but it's then how do I get that model of, because in NetSuite, right, there's a lot of rules around subsidiaries where if you've got a vendor bill with subsidiary A, like you can't pay that vendor bill with a bank account with subsidiary B, right? So that it's that type of stuff that might not be caught by, like it might not caught, but like it might not be discussed or might not be an issue for your auditors if they're only looking at the consolidated financials. That are definitely going to be something that's going to be a system limitation of NetSuite just based on proper subsidiary, the way you're supposed to do your subsidiary structure.
Yeah. Interesting. Eric, you have anything more on the technical side? Because otherwise I was going to shift gears a little bit.
No, I think we've got about 12 minutes left here, so take it away. And then with a few minutes left, I'll try to get some of these audience questions quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
All right. So Paul, I wanted to ask you, I noticed you in looking at your site that you also offer a course for accountants on safe searches, I think. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
sure.
and maybe any other recommendations that you might have for somebody who's in the accounting role at a company that's about to do the implementation, and that's for the implementation, and maybe it's all new to them. Like, what other resources besides your course would you recommend?
Yeah. So the story for that Save Search course, I follow a LinkedIn influencer named Justin Welsh, which is he's a big sort of the strategy of my LinkedIn, strategy, I guess. And he, has a course that I was taking. And at the same time as I was taking that course, I had one of my clients that was like, hey, like, can you help me run like a list of all my journal entries? The auditors are asking. It's like a fairly common request that, in my opinion, fairly straightforward to do with a Save Search. And I was like, oh, well, like, this is how you do it. Or like, I think I ended up building it for him. But then he's like, well, how did you learn how to build Save Searches? I was like, oh, trial and error. Like, how else do you learn? And I was like, and then I was like thinking about like this course that I was taking for social media. I was like, I could like build like a quick Save Search course that is, low production, hopefully help somebody like so they don't have to just do trial and error, because trial and error is definitely a great way to learn if you have the time, but most people don't have time to spend 2 hours trying to figure out how to build, a search if you've got 10 other things going on. So I really built the course. It really goes through 3 common searches that I think I've done for probably 2/3 of my clients at some point, and kind of just going through like, how do you build like an all posting transaction Save Search with all the various segments. It goes into how to update, how to run a Save Search with customers, I think, that are missing email addresses, and then how to re-upload that into NetSuite with a CSV upload. And then I think there was one other, I don't know, I go into 3 reports. I don't remember what the third one was, but all like, it's about an hour and a half course. I think it's $50. So it's fairly, straightforward. And it's really just built on, they're all searches that I've used for many of my clients. And so the idea is really to just say, hey, like, if you want to learn how to do this on your own without, coming to me or your NetSuite consultant, your partner, your support partner to do this, take this course and, hopefully I think it's helped some people like with kind of learning saved searches.
Awesome.
I think as far as like other people, there's a woman, Sarah Emery, I think that's her name, who I follow on LinkedIn. She's got some really good YouTube videos that are really helpful. I actually think that the NetSuite help articles are actually pretty useful compared to at least other systems that I've used. I think Anchor Group has some good resources on their website. So I think those are a couple of the help resources that I would recommend. I mean, I guess the other one it would be Nick, or not Nick, on the Reddit post, the Reddit NetSuite page. Nick is the primary admin, and so he responds a lot on there. So he's really, I go to Reddit quite frequently. There's a good Slack group. So those are 2 other resources for people to kind of ask questions. I'd say those are, I guess, less help, or like less learning guides and more kind of like specific help. But I think you can pick up on quite a bit of stuff by learning, just kind of reading what other questions people are asking.
I agree. One other question before we start to wind things down, and I don't know if you've thought about this yet, but are you planning to go to Sweet World this year? Have you been in the past? Are you? Cool.
Yeah, I went last year. It was a lot of fun. Planning to be there again this year. Yeah, it's fun to just kind of go be with a bunch of other NetSuite people. Mostly like, I'm fully remote, and it's nice to meet people face to face and interact with people and see people I hadn't seen since last year. But yeah, Sweet World is a lot of fun. It's definitely, I think, a good event for people to go to, especially if you are involved as like a partner or a consultant in the NetSuite world. I mean, I think as an end user, I think some of those courses can be helpful, but it also is quite a bit of promoting NetSuite, understandably. But it's definitely fun. There's a ton of resources there for people. I'll be there, so if you want to meet with me to talk about data migration, happy to chat. What about you guys? Will you be there?
I'm not planning on it. Yeah,
No?
unfortunately, but the temptation is there for sure. So I might change my mind. We'll see.
I guess they haven't announced the performer. I don't think they have. Or maybe. Usually I see that all over LinkedIn once they announce it. So.
Yep. Just one other quick note. You mentioned Sarah Emery, and I keep. We have a huge list of people and ideas for future episodes, and she is on that list.
For sure.
So yeah, if you don't track her on LinkedIn or follow her, I encourage you to do so. She's got great content. So
yeah, her content's very good.
Yep. Eric, anything else, or should we go through some questions real quick?
Yeah, we can get in and try to get into a couple of these. You mentioned the multi-subsidiary challenge. Jocelyn has a question. What is the biggest issue or maybe the biggest gotcha at migration time that companies don't plan for? Is that it, or is there a bigger one that you're holding on to?
The biggest gotcha. I mean, in general, I think the level of effort that it just takes to get the data migrated. I mean, I think the intercompany piece, I mean, that's also very challenging. Getting those advanced intercompany journal entries into NetSuite correctly, if you haven't tracked the historical data in the right format, will be near impossible. So I would definitely, I've got a couple articles on my website that kind of go into it, but that is definitely an area that will be very challenging for somebody who's not, if you don't, advanced intercompany journal entries are very difficult to work with anyways. And so like you got to have a good understanding of how that works, plus have your financials in good shape. And I guess in the other component is like the configuring your intercompany accounts and entities correctly. Like there's that, you have to get that part right as well. And implementation partners should be doing that and helping you with that. If they're not, you can ask them. But I would definitely say that there's definitely a level of effort and some strategies to getting that in correctly. Yeah.
Great. Fred has one here. Curious about how you would approach migrating data when there's more than one data source. So maybe it's more than QuickBooks for some reason, or maybe customers are in one place and transactions are in another. How do you go about that sort of thing? Or this one, not something I thought of. One system's in one language and there's data in another language, so multi-language type of stuff.
I've never dealt with multi-language before, so that would definitely be a new experience for me. If you have two different systems, that definitely adds a level of complexity, and I've had that before. Usually it's either a CRM where the client's got, has contacts and they want to bring, the leads and the contacts into NetSuite. But then you also have to make and then in QuickBooks, they've got the actual sales, right? So those are, in QuickBooks, it's configured as customers. And so if you don't have a really good mapping between the the contact data in the CRM and who the customer is in QuickBooks, it can be very challenging to kind of make sure that you're not creating the same record twice, or that you're assigning all that contact information in the CRM to the correct customer. In general, I'm an accountant, so I always defer, like QuickBooks is the source of truth for what I'm doing.
Right.
Now that, obviously if you're a salesperson, you might think differently, but in general, I think that's kind of what I would consider to be like your source of truth, and you're kind of working around the data that's in QuickBooks.
You're working backwards from there.
Yeah, exactly. But that's definitely can be a challenge to make sure, and it gets back to that mapping exercise of making sure hey, my map file, now I'm not just mapping between QuickBooks and NetSuite, I'm mapping between QuickBooks and NetSuite and CRM and NetSuite, and definitely adds an additional layer of work. Yeah.
I look at it, the whole data migration problem, for me, I don't do that. I don't do data migrations, but I do integrations, and it's essentially the same thing. The scale and the time frame is a little different, right? A migration is like a huge amount of data once, and then integrations are more smaller amounts of data more continuously, right? But there's always this layer of normalization. You have to, whatever's coming out of the external systems, you've got to normalize them into something NetSuite understands. No matter how many external systems there are, you need to get them into one format that NetSuite understands. And so that's where a huge amount of effort goes in integrations too, is that data normalization, whether that's some sort of automated mapping or someone manually combing through CSVs or whatever export format you have.
And I think that's sort of the moving analogy, right, is perfect. That's some of that contact data from 2 years ago, that's your old t-shirt that you haven't worn in 5 years. Take that to Goodwill. We don't need that.
They're never going to call you.
That data, yeah, they haven't signed with you yet. So they're not calling back. So I think that would be a scenario where you might be all right, yeah, that data is not as useful.
All right, we are at our time, so I do think I will wrap us up. Thank you, Paul, first of all, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah,
thank you, everyone who joined us live. The recording will be available over on the Salto YouTube channel and in the SuiteScript Stories podcast feed. And if you'd like to get in touch with Tim or I, you can email me, eric@stoic.software. You can check out Tim's website, timdietrich.me. If you'd like to learn more about Salto, check out salto.io for a demo on their DevOps platform. And Paul, where can people find out more about you and what you're doing?
Yeah, so people can either find me, my email is paul@optimaldataconsulting.com. You can also Google Optimal Data or find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so that's another great way to find me.
Definitely give Paul a follow. He's putting out a lot of helpful content.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, everyone out there. We do hope you join us next time as we continue to explore and highlight different stories from around the SuiteScript space. And we'll see you then. Bye-bye.